Behold! The sword of power. Excalibur.
Welcome to episode 15 of the Oh Gosh Oh Golly Oh Wow podcast, the podcast where we talk about the Marvel Comics series Excalibur and nothing but Excalibur every week for 126 plus weeks. This week, in an extra special episode 15, we're taking a temporary detour off the course of the Cross Time Caper to cover a very important special issue, none other than Mojo Mayhem. Just in case you don't recall, Mojo Mayhem involves the super alien, super spineless reality TV super mogul Mojo and cat slapping and a royal wedding involving a princess who can't stop thinking about Nightcrawler, and Sugah, Wolvie, Lil Dazzler, Lil Havok, Shower, Lil Longshot, Colossusus, and Psychilde. That's right, the X-Babies are here to mess up your shit and steal your heart. Mojo Mayhem was originally published in December 1989 in and around the release of Excalibur number 13, though it's set prior to the Cross Time Caper. The creative team is Chris Claremont on writing, Art Adams on pencils, Terry Austin and Bob Wyasek on inks, Glynis Oliver on colors, Tom Orzechowski and Jade Modet on lettering, and Terry Kavanagh on editing.
What's going on?
They're having a wizard's duel. What's that mean?
Oh, it's a battle of wits. The players change themselves to different things in an attempt to destroy one another.
Destroy?
But just watch, boy, just watch. You'll get the idea.
We've got an absolutely perfect scholar with us today to help us parse all the self-reflexive mayhem of this issue's bite-sized, big-impact guest stars, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, some quick intros to the regulars. I am Dr. Anna Papard. I write and talk about issues of representation in comics, plying my talents on websites and books, academic journals, and university classrooms, and on another podcast, which I co-host with a host of this podcast called Three Panel Contrast. I talk about sex and gender and monsters and sexed and gendered and sexually gendered monsters and Nightcrawler and occasionally other things like basketball and pro wrestling. I'm Kurt Wagner's still unofficial PR manager, and I have mixed feelings about the X-Babies, but I'm here to be sold on them and know this is the perfect crew to do it. Mav, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am the very model of a maverick major domo. Oh gosh, oh golly, Vox Popcast and some other shows. The idea of hating X-Babies delightful seems impossible, especially for Anna who loves everything. It seems implausible. But for now, this is enough because this is getting way too long. But really, not liking X-Babies, Anna's just wrong. And that seemed like such a better idea when I wrote that this morning.
I'm impressed. I'm very impressed.
How do you not like X-Babies? This is I mean, like I read the show notes, are behind the scenes prepared notes for this, and I'm just like, what's wrong with her? I don't want to do the show with her anymore. How are we even friends, Anna?
My goodness, the fire is happening already. Well, we're gonna get to it, but first we got to get through these.
So yeah, I like these.
Fair enough. Andrew, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, I'm Dr. Andrew DeMann. I am on faculty at St. Jerome's University in the English department, and I am the project lead for the Claremont Run, which is a big Chris Claremont research thing with a social media wing. I am also a massive defender of Mojo Mayhem in particular, and I'm delighted to hear that Mav's already on my team. And yeah, depending on how it goes with Anna, because I know we might have to sell her on this. This could be like our last episode, because
yeah, this is it. I mean,
this is the hill I will die on. I love this book. I think it's
oh
amazing.
my god.
Oh my god, we're keeping the podcast going at least until the Warlord issue. So, like, I mean, I can promise several more episodes at least. My goodness. Okay, anyway, we are joined, as I mentioned, by a truly wonderful guest who I was surprised and delighted said yes to me, basically cold calling her to ask if she'd be interested in reading a very weird old X-Men comic and chatting with us about it. The podcast is thrilled to welcome Dr. Gwen Tarbox. Welcome, Gwen.
Well, hi there. How's everyone? Well, I can tell how everyone is. You're giddy with excitement over this issue. So
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
are, indeed. So I'll tell our listeners a little bit about Gwen. Dr. Gwen Tarbox is a professor in the Department of English at Western Michigan University, where she teaches comic studies, children's and YA literature, and American popular culture. Her monograph, Children's and YA Comics, was released by Bloomsbury in 2020, and she has co-edited with Dr. Michelle Ann Abate, Graphic Novels for Children and Young Adults, a collection of critical essays. It's a wonderful collection. Currently, Dr. Tarbox is writing a monograph entitled The Awkward Spectacle, Coming of Age in Contemporary Middle Grade Comics, which sounds completely awesome. Now, Gwen, I know you know your comics. Everyone also now knows that based on that fabulous bio. And I know you've written about some superhero fare in your research on children's comics, but is this your first time encountering this series that is Excalibur?
sadly, yes, and I'm really embarrassed because I lived in England during the 1980s, but I was really involved with like new wave music and everything, and not so much comics at that time, but
Fair
it was a
enough.
lot of fun to read it.
So what's your kind of background in sort of incorporating some superhero stuff into your work? Like, are you familiar with kind of the wider X-Men franchise at all?
Yeah, it debuted the year I was born, so you could say that I've kind of known about it for almost my entire life. And as a kid, I liked it because the school story kind of got a more contemporary refresh, and I liked that a lot. But as far as my scholarship is concerned, you can't really write about children's comics and not write about superheroes. And so in my book, I definitely treat sort of the movement from comic strips to comic books, and then sort of the movement into graphic novels in the 21st century. So it's not a huge section of my work, but it definitely is there.
Yeah, well, I'll be very interested in hearing kind of your thoughts about how to situate this in a history or a discourse of children's comics, which is one of the things that I really wanted to have you on to do. I want to talk about your first impressions of Excalibur, but maybe we'll actually get back to that after we do the intro to the issue, because I just want to know basically whether this comic made any sense to you at all. But maybe we'll come back to that, and I want to talk a little bit about the history of children's comics and sort of the academic study of children's comics as well. But let's do our intro, and we'll come back to it in a moment. I know many people probably have possibly a vague memory of this very zany comic, so we'll catch you all up with that plot summary. Mojo Mayhem opens, appropriately enough, in the Mojoverse, where the X-Babies and Ricochet Rita are running from Mojo's trademark police, despite Wolvie's protestations. They barricade themselves in the house of Stan and Jack, while the trademark police open fire. There's an explosion and the X-Babies disappear. They've been transported to Earth 616, in other words, the prime Marvel reality. Desperate to retrieve the X-Babies, his ratings darlings, Mojo enlists the help of a skull-faced guy called the Agent. From there, we check in with Kitty Pryde on a train from Edinburgh to London, reflecting on recent events. Back at the lighthouse, she got fed up working on repairs and struggling with Widget while missing Ileana, so Kurt, assuring Brian that Kitty's the responsible type, urged her to take the weekend off to see her favorite band, Cats Laughing. She does, and has a great time, even meeting the band backstage. But she's still melancholy, reflecting on her unpredictable phasing powers and the death of the X-Men. Finally, she turns out the light in her train cabin, but she hears whispers in the dark. Suddenly, a light flares. It's Lil Dazzler and the X-Babies! Kitty freaks out and phases out of the train, landing in a river. The X-Babies find her and explain their situation, that they've lost their guardian, Ricochet Rita, and need to get her back. A road trip ensues in which Kitty tries to contact Excalibur. The phone lines are down, and they're chased by the Agent, who impersonates various people to try and get the X-Babies to sign various contracts. Each time the Agent convinces one of the X-Babies to sign, they disappear, absorbed into the Agent. Along the way, a police car is stolen, which is then switched for a van previously occupied by Chris Claremont and other comics creators. Eventually, the action converges at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where Judith Razendil, Queen of Ruritania, is getting married. When the priest asks if there are any objections, Kitty phases through the floor with a giant sign asking for Excalibur's help. The priest becomes the Agent, and there's a hijinks-filled fight, which results in Phoenix unmasking the Agent as Ricochet Rita, warped by Mojo to serve him. The X-Babies offer to go back to Mojo World in exchange for Rita's freedom. Mojo agrees, but as the X-Babies step through the portal to Mojo World, Rita jumps in after them. It seems for a moment that all was for naught until a Mojoverse coda. Because the X-Babies came of their own free will rather than signing a contract, they're able to demand better working conditions and perks. A frowning Mojo realizes he may have made a grave error. So, getting back to those first impressions, and we'll kick it to you first, Gwen. As a newcomer to the world of Excalibur, but not a newcomer to the world of X-Men, and certainly not a newcomer to the world of comics, did this comic make any sense to you at all?
Okay, it did.
Good,
but,
good.
But honestly, I just have to tell you that like your summarizing skills are amazing. Because if someone listening to this has not yet looked at this comic and then like reads it, they're going to be like, "Wow, Anna, you know what you're doing." I'll tell you what I enjoyed the most. I enjoyed the Kitty Pride scenes because she is by
Yeah.
far my favorite character, and I was about this age at this time, and I was a groupie of many bands in London, and so this is like pretty much my adolescence right here on this page. It's way cool. But I'll tell you what I do like. There's an incredible sense of humor in this entire issue. There's self-reflexivity in ways that are amazing, not just about X-Men, but about the world of, even if you want to think about it, like this was the height of child actors. And these kids, like basically negotiating for the terms of their service was just hysterical. So yeah, it took me a minute, I'll admit. There was some culture shock, but I warmed up very quickly and really enjoyed reading it.
Aw, I love that personal connection to Kitty in this time and place. That's amazing. And yeah, that comment about child actors is so intriguing. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about reading that context into it because I was thinking mostly of sort of the comics-based self-reflexivity, but there is that larger cultural self-reflexivity as well. I think you're absolutely right. Well, can we talk a little bit about where we might situate this sort of in some of the work that you do, Gwen, in children's comics? I'm specifically wondering, does this relate to other things that you've studied sort of in the history of children's comics? Does this relate to sort of this moment of comics publishing? Did you have any thoughts about how we might situate this comic there?
Yeah, one of the things that we do when we talk about children's literature and children's culture is we think about intended audience. And the intended audience of this comic isn't necessarily children.
Yeah.
And so that means that we're sort of dealing with a situation where we're looking at children as portrayed by adults, writing for adults. And so this comic is really different than, say, something like Scooby-Doo that would have been written at the same time, but was intended for child readers. And as a result, the children themselves come off a little bit differently. They're much more like miniature adults, in my view, where they have sort of a lot of understanding of the world and how it operates. And so the question isn't sort of how do these naive children get, from point A to point B? Rather, it's these children are causing a heck of a lot of mayhem. And I don't know, I actually, if I had been a kid at this point, I would have loved this comic. But I always read up anyway, and I think I would have related to a lot of what was going on in it and found it really funny. But as far as children's comics at this time, this is very different. The way that the kids have a lot of volition and also are clearly being used for a larger narrative purpose. That's really the biggest difference. There's not a lot of morality in this comic when it comes to children, and that's actually a fresh breath of fresh air, I should say.
Well, where does this then kind of fit in the history of, well, maybe I should ask this a different way. I mean, when you say that you study children's comics, does that mean comics about children or does that mean comics starring children? Because you're emphasizing the distinction there.
Right. One of the things that we think about in the field of children's comics is what do we mean by that term? And what I do is I'm looking at comics that are written for a child audience. And in children's literature in general, what we're always dealing with there are adults writing for children, and those adult agendas enter into the text, right? Mm-hmm. So there's almost always some didacticism. It's just as you move into the 21st century, that didacticism becomes hidden, right? So for instance, a lot of the sort of authorial intent starts to be voiced by children themselves in the first person. This is a trend that we see in children in text-only children's literature in the 1970s, with this huge spate of authors writing for children and using the first person in very convincing dialogue. So think of Judy Blume, for instance. It's sort of the quintessential example of a 1970s author who was so convincing, for instance, in Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, that I told my mother I wanted to write to Margaret. Oh. And my mother was like, it was so cute because my mom was like, Gwen, look at the lady on the back of the book. Look at she's Judy Blume is an author. And I was like, no, Margaret is real, and so it's that kind of engaging narration is what we call it in the field that allowed someone like Judy Blume to put forward a lot of really interesting ideas in her texts about how children should behave and what was and what was not appropriate, but in such a way it wasn't like some adult telling them what to do. And so to me, that's sort of when I talk about this comic, which has children in it, but wasn't written for children, well, didactic imperative disappears. And so you can now look at these children and ask a different set of questions like, what is the narrative purpose of including these mini-me's? And you guys would probably be much better placed to talk about that because you're experts in Excalibur and X-Men as to what they're doing here, but they're not children in the same sense as if this were being written specifically for young kids, if that makes sense. And it's not that we're not interested in the depiction of children in adult text, but we just ask different questions.
No, that's completely fair. I mean, what's particularly vibrant to you about, because you study text-based children's and YA literature as well, what's particularly interesting to you about children's comics? Like, what's particularly interesting about sort of the opportunities to represent subjectivity in this medium that particularly attracts you to those sets of questions that you're talking about?
Right. Well, first of all, there are some technical things about comics that fascinate me. First of all, like just figuring out point of view and the way that that's complicated in a visual narrative. Very few comics creators writing for children necessarily show you the world through a child's eyes. And when that does happen, it's usually only for a few moments, but it just kind of disrupts that engaging narration because you're constantly looking at the character from sort of a distance. And I like that fact. I think it actually can encourage kids to sort of think about the way that the text is put together in different ways than with a text-only narrative. And I'm also interested in something that's really key to contemporary children's literature, which is this idea that the lessons, if you will, of the text are often conveyed silently in comics in ways that it's difficult to do in text-only narratives. And an example that I give in my book is there's a really wonderful Portland-based comics creator called Barry Deutsch. And he started off as a political cartoonist, but then started to write middle grade novels. And he's written what's called the Hereville series, which is about a young Jewish Orthodox girl growing up in Iowa who wants to fight dragons. I think y'all would really like this comic, actually. It's beautifully done. But one of the things that he's trying to demonstrate in the comic is that there's a tradition in Jewish families of training children to become good at argumentation by challenging their assumptions and asking them to think about issues from a variety of perspectives. And in the first volume of Hereville, the heroine called Mirka is arguing with her stepmother. And there's this wonderful page where in the center panel you have the stepmother who's called Fruma, who's making all of these objections to Mirka's argument that she wants to go and kill dragons, right? And there's this cascade of speech balloons or word balloons around her head. And on the periphery of the page, there's Mirka making all of her objections. Well, like about 200 pages later, when Mirka is engaged in a battle with a troll, she ends up arguing with the troll in a way that saves her life, and the exact same set of panels and arrangement of word balloons is occurring in that particular scene. And never once in the book does Mirka ever say, "Oh, thank you, Fruma, for helping me to understand the importance of argument," or anything. It's just that visually you can see that Mirka has picked this up and utilized it. And it's that kind of silent sort of messaging that I find so intriguing in children's texts, where the impulse in really poorly done children's texts is to like have an adult give advice and have the kids say, "Thank you, wise adult," And so I think what comics allow creators to do is to make a lot of that happen silently. So there's a lot going on formally in children's comics that I like to explore.
Yeah, and I mean, reading your work on children's comics that I've read before, I was very sort of moved by your argument that, as you've been talking about in the history of children's literature, it's about sort of finding the agency of that child voice, right? And if we're thinking about a medium with the sort of inherent subjectiveness and participatoriness and like almost inherent self-reflexivity of comics, which are some of the things that you're talking about, right? When you're talking about the formal production of the thing is evident just as a matter of course, because that's how comics work. And you can have connections suggested through formal gestures rather than just told to you. And like the agency that allows a reader to have is a way that, you can insert that child agency into a text even when it's written by adults. And I love that as an idea for how children's literature can be particularly vibrant in this form.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, let's bring Andrew and Mav into this conversation with some first impressions, because you both went in hard with how much you love this text. Are some of these things that Gwen's bringing up about, well, I almost want to ask that question about, like, how do we know that this isn't a text for children, which might seem obvious because we just know what the audience was for this historically, but I mean, what signs do we have in this text that it isn't for children? Like, why are we so safe in making that assumption?
I think it's important to look at this in the context in which it was released. I think the stuff Gwen's saying is very important about the distinguishing between texts that are of children and texts for children, and some that sort of, walk that line in between. I'm not a child per se when this comes out, right? I'm older. I'm not an adult, but I'm like 15, 16 years old. So, but I think it's important to look at this in like the cultural context of what was coming out in pop culture when this happened, right? So this is like 1989. It might have been 1990 by the time it was actually on shelves. And we are in a world where pop culture properties just have baby versions.
Mm-hmm.
And starting with Muppet Babies, which is delightful.
Agreed.
And again, if Anna doesn't like Muppet Babies, this show really is over. Okay, this is it.
I have fond memories of Muppet Babies. Don't worry.
Wonderful. So along the tradition of Muppet Babies and much lesser other similar shows, Pup Named Scooby Doo, Flintstone Kids, people are just copying this. Oh, we're going to do a baby version of because Muppet Babies was so wonderful. And X Babies is the one that works for me because it's not a kids show, because it is more, particularly with Mojo Mayhem, but even with their earlier appearance and their later appearances, X Babies it's not that didactic lesson. It's commenting on the cultural moment of the cynicism, especially with Mojo. It's the cynicism of what makes a world where, for a blatant cash grab, we're going to make baby versions of our other property, which is exactly what Mojo does in this book. So it is so metatextually aware that it is, there's a postmodernity to it in a non-cynical sense that, since I didn't know any of these words, but yet, I wasn't, I was not an academic yet. I was an actual teenager, but it appealed to me because it was doing something that I was enjoying. And it was allowing me to think about these sort of things and still enjoy it. It is still quirky and fun. And you can see that, little Daz doesn't know why, but she is still embodying where grown-up Dazzler was in the comics at this time. Rogue is still where grown-up Rogue was. If you take in their earlier appearances where it's a slightly different team, where there is a baby kitty and she's younger, so she wets her pants, and like just looking at all these little connections that happen between the X Babies and where the actual X-Men series are is at that time. It's always weird talking podcast time travel, talking about a text we are reading now that was produced then, but looking where those things are and how they're coming together was natural and fun for me even then, without the tools that I have to do it now.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, I like what you're bringing up about the lack of cynicism, because I think that's probably going to be a major part of the charm that you're all finding in this comic. And like, to be clear, I don't hate this comic. I really, really don't. I would say that I appreciate it more since rereading it, knowing that Andrew loved it so much and kind of giving it a little bit more benefit of the doubt. But Andrew, I'll let you do your first impression bit. What's important about this comic? Why do you love it so much?
Well, just to follow up on what Mav was saying, I think that the children's literature aspect of this is something of a Trojan horse. I think it's meant to disarm us, because I do think this is a story about grief. But at the same time, again, coming back to what Mav was saying, because Mav said everything I already was going to say, but in a better way. It's participating in the same genre that it's critiquing. And what I mean by that is like all the best satire. Like Watchmen is saying superheroes have these limitations, but it's also a really good superhero story. And I do think that in the middle section, the X Babies are genuinely delightful. So it's sort of critiquing and participating in a way that I really like. I think that's the best kind of satire. And I think it sets up this story of grief. To that end, I'm just going to read what I posted on the Claremont run, because it's going to be more succinct and faster. On its surface, Mojo Mayhem is a silly romp with the obnoxiously cute X-Babies, but that belies a melancholy core to the story, which explores concepts of depression, survivor's guilt, and a deeply resonant, elaborate fantasy of coming to terms with the ones we've lost. Oddly enough, like King Lear before it, Mojo Mayhem can be seen as a story of absolution, a narrative narrative crafted around a protagonist's pursuit of release from overwhelming senses of guilt and shame, with Kitty Pryde cast in the Lear role. The story offers resolution on an ongoing character arc surrounding Kitty's grief and survivor's guilt over what she believes is the death of the X-Men in Fall of the Mutants and Illyana in Inferno. Kitty is depressed, but distracting herself with Excalibur. The tension of confined living brings some emotions to the surface, however, and Kitty needs some time alone, which ultimately leads to her acknowledging and reflecting upon her feelings in a way that she has up to this point largely avoided. Coincidentally, Kitty's inability to control her phasing power in the issue forms an apt metaphor for her depression. The idea of drifting off and being unable to stay grounded and focused in the moment is relatable for many people suffering from depression. Relatedly, people who have suffered through the loss of a loved one will often become fixated on fantasies of second chances in which they are able to act in such a way as to prevent the tragedy from occurring. Against all odds, this is what Kitty gets with the X-Babies. Normally the junior X-Man, Kitty instantly becomes the adult in the room with the X-Babies, offering her agency and responsibility in a way that she never really had with the actual team, and placing her in the savior position by default, an obligation she longs for. The greatest fantasy moment for Kitty's survivor's guilt emerges from the resolution. The agent lays claim to the X-Babies through contracts, establishing a deathly permanency, but Kitty uses her powers to phase the signatures off the paper, reversing the irreversible. On a broader scale, she gets to be with the X-Men again, gets to say goodbye, and even gets to stand witness to a heroic self-sacrifice that is parallel to the one Kitty missed in Eagle Plaza. It's everything that Kitty desperately wants and helps her to move forward. And I will be quiet now.
Oh, Andrew, that's
That's beautiful.
Yeah, Jinx, that's so beautiful. I'm like, geez, we should just end the thing now. How could we add anything better to that?
Thanks for joining us, folks.
Yeah, really. That is beautiful.
That is beautiful. Well, maybe in light of that and some of the questions that we've been talking about sort of in children and agency and sort of Kitty being in this in-between space as the teenager character, I mean, maybe I'll go back to you, Gwen, and talk a little bit about, because you said also that you have a particular affection for Kitty as a character. How do you see her kind of agency exercised in this text? Like, if we're going to be asking those questions that you mentioned about this text, about is this sort of adults imprinting onto children, or is this like adding sort of a sense of agency to a youthful character, if not a child character in this case? How do you read Kitty's agency in this comic? Is she sort of a convincing, complex protagonist? I mean, I think we're going to say yes, but in what senses is she those things? And in what sense did kind of her journey particularly resonate with you or in general in this comic?
Yeah, I mean, if I can riff off something that Andrew said, in some ways she's the still point in this comic, which otherwise is totally chaotic. And so when you asked me how I liked it, when I got about 5 pages in, I was like, good God,
Yeah.
It's like, I'm going to keep going, but then when I got to the part where Kitty is talking about needing to get away and knowing that she needs that for herself and advocates for herself, actually, even in 1989, that is a pretty amazing, statement for a teenage girl to be making in popular culture. And when she does that, and you see her like really reflecting on why she needed to get away and what it did for her, I think that is probably one of the more liberatory moments I've seen in teen culture in the 1980s. So, I actually was deeply impressed by that. And then later I noticed that when she's being very defensive of the little X-Babies, and they're sort of like they're a pain, but they're my pain, is really sweet too. And I mean, I guess you could look at it in traditional coded terms of, oh, that's, the proto-maternal instincts, but really I didn't see it that way. I think that the text argues convincingly for her empathy for others, which I really don't like to see being gendered. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I see it just as an empathy, a general empathy in this text that she has for others. And also the way that she's drawn in those middle segments emphasizes, I think, her youth in some really important ways. She's shown to be extremely vulnerable. And so I found it to be really powerful. I hope that kind of gets at it, but I think that her agency is different. If you think about other young women who are portrayed in popular culture, I mean, even the John Hughes movies, it's very rare that a young character just says, nope, I've had it, put a fork in me, I'm done, goodbye, going, I'm going to go do the things I want to do, and I'm going to think the things I want to think. And I thought it was very convincing and not in a patronizing way at all.
We were just talking about with Dr. Margaret Galvan, the episode before this one, about connections between Kitty and John Hughes movies and that 80s and early 90s context. So that's an excellent callback. Other thoughts about Kitty in this text? I'm sure Andrew's going to have thoughts, but I'm sure you will as well, Mav.
This is one one where, you know, the cover says Excalibur. I mean, it's a special edition, much like the first one. But this is not an Excalibur comic.
It's a
Barely
Kitty solo story that
this
happens
is a
to
Kitty
feature
Pride
Excalibur.
story. And, you know, the other Excalibur members are on like 4 pages. It's fine. But I think the things that Gwen's talking about right now, the John Hughes-esque of it, is very much set up by the fact that unlike other teenagers outside of Disney things where everybody's parents dead, but unlike other teenagers of the day, Kitty is not a regular teen, not because of her superpowers, but because she has, throughout her narrative existence, mostly existed without her parents, right? Her parents are alive at this point in the comics, but she's introduced and then shipped off to boarding school. And then when everybody at the boarding school dies, for some reason, she doesn't go back home. She just goes and hangs out with, you know, her professor's girlfriend in London. There's a lot of weirdness, but she ends up in this space where she is a child technically that people treat as an adult, and she's earned it, and she's earned it with the readers. And so you end up with a place where, because Kurt thinks of her as an adult, you know, and he gives her, you know, he steps in and says, Brian, leave her the F alone. I'm doing, you know, like she hears him, but he gives her the agency. He says, look, let her do her thing. She's in a mood. Let her have her weekend and we'll all be better. And he lets her go away. That's Kurt showing his friendship and showing his respect for Kitty as an individual. But Kitty lives in a world where she can just, at 15 or however old she is, she can just decide to up and go to follow her favorite band 300 miles away. You know, they say it's not close, and they say it's not the first time. She can just do this sort of thing. She doesn't ask anybody. She makes this decision. So I think there's something appealing to a young reader, a youth reader, if not a child reader, you know, about the nature of grown-upness that Kitty has aside from being a superhero. The adults in her life, the remaining adults in her life, other than Brian, who's a jerk, which we've talked about, but the adults in her life respect her individuality and respect her agency. So that allows her to, when she has trouble, when she's trying to, you know, protect the X-babies, and she's saying, I'm not prepared for all of this. I need Excalibur's help. You know, it doesn't make her seem like she's running away asking for help from grown-ups, because they respect her. It makes her seem like she's looking for her help from her team rather than her grown-ups.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, obviously, I love that moment with Kurt and Kitty so much. I love the extra thing of her hearing him say the explanation to Brian and commenting on it. It's so good. Yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
Oh, no, I completely agree with what Mav was saying. Yeah, I really like the depiction of Kurt's emotional intelligence. I think that's important in contrast to Brian's. And I really like what Gwen was saying about Kitty kind of being this calm within this very chaotic issue, because I do think, like, when you're dealing with big emotions, as children's literature often does, I think it's good to be really counterbalanced very effectively, and having Kitty be sort of this very rational, intelligent character encountering the ridiculous, and then slowly but surely modeling our progressive acceptance of the silliness to the point where by the end of this text she's enthusiastic and she's all in and she's part of this X-Babies world. I think that's really important, again, in terms of distinguishing this from like a children's literature alone perspective.
Well, I was just going to say one other thing about this as someone who was a young person at this time as well. The way that the band that she goes to see, the fact that they're women, the fact that they embrace her and there's sort of like this definite moment of understanding is really important, because if you were a young woman from the late 70s and well into the 1980s who liked music and who followed bands and did that sort of thing, there was a real derisory way you were treated by most adults as being, you know, frivolous and silly and an airhead and all of that. And actually, most of us who were way into music to that extent weren't frivolous people, and we really were interested in culture and ideas that were being expressed by some of the more underground bands that we were going to. And I remember really being frustrated at that point. So I have to say that, you know, this text has a really weird dual address thing going on. And, you know, any young men or women reading this text are getting an interesting dose of sort of taking young women seriously. And I think that would have been almost revolutionary at this time. Like I said, I wish I had the wherewithal to go and pick this up when I was at this age. By this point, I was a bit older and I was actually starting grad school. But my point is that like if you go back about 5 or 6 years towards the early to mid 80s, this was kind of my world, and it's interesting to sort of see it treated respectfully.
And it's like, I mean, yeah, it's very affecting to me to see like female fandom treated respectfully, right? Because I mean, that's often such a central point of denigrating women's experience, but also such a central point of women expressing their agency, you know, going all the way back to something like Beatlemania or Elvis fandom or any of these things, right? So it is a really important moment, and I agree. I mean, I'm interested in that question of vulnerability that Gwen brought up as well, because we have another scene of Kitty in her underpants here, and we've talked a couple of times on the podcast about scenes of her. For Gwen, she's been naked in front of her team twice in this comic already.
Really? Okay.
Yes, in scenes that sort of play with kind of erotic fantasy in terms of a multi-gazeness of like, you know,
Right.
the fantasy of exhibitionism. And obviously she's becoming a spectacle for the reader as well. And we've talked about the complications of that. So I was interested in how this scene kind of read within the history of that. But like, what did we make of kind of this scene? And I've got my take on it, but I'm sort of curious about, did we see this kind of playing with that exhibitionism and that problematic but potentially empowering dual gaze, or were we a little bit more okay with this scene than some of the other ones? I was curious about our reactions.
Curious about yours.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
this is one of the weird ones where, well, okay, I'll go first just so you don't have to, because that way I can ask my question. But for me, this one's different than the most. I mean, okay, so anybody who listens to our show knows I adore Alan Davis, right? Like he's our regular artist, and I love his work. And I don't want to say apologetic, I am understanding of the sexualized nature of what he does with, particularly when he's trying to do it appropriately with Kitty. This is different for me because this is Art Adams. Art Adams clearly is capable of sexualizing a teenage girl in his artwork. See, anytime he has ever drawn Ilyana, and that's what he does. Kitty doesn't come across that way for me here. She comes across as, I mean, yes, there's a sexualized nature of it. She's still a half-naked young girl. I get that, but he's treating her differently than he treats Ilyana in Asgardian Wars or other, you know, Adams is a cheesecake artist. That's what he is.
Yeah, he really is.
And I, you know, I like his work, but anything from X-Men to Monkey Man and O'Brien, that's what Art Adams does. But here he is treating her awkwardly and embarrassedly in a reasonable way of, yes, of course, she was sleeping and, you know, she was trying to go to sleep and then she had an accident and now she's outdoors, and it's not played for, you know, she's not arching her back,
Yeah,
you know, saying come hither, which is how he normally would draw this. So there's restraint for me that I'm wondering if that's what you see, or if you, or does it, I mean, you know, I'm also a boy, right? So does it still come across as, oh, look, girl in her underpants? I don't know.
Just to add to that quickly, I'd point out, for my money, it's not a narrative contrivance either. Like, I think it adds something that she's vulnerable outside of this train. That's kind of a panic situation. And I really like the setup that she has pieces of all of her former teammates' uniforms coming together on her.
Mhm.
I think that's a nice symbolic touch.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we always have to look to, like when it's sort of nakedness of, well, kind of any female character, but especially a younger female character like this, is, you know, like, is it warranted by the narrative? You know, is it adding something to our understanding of the character, and is it additive to the narrative, or is it cheesecake, right? And I would argue that this is additive as well. I think that emphasis on her vulnerability and sort of what she's experiencing there, and even just the naturalisticness of how she's dressed in the train car is like almost identifiable. I mean, that's a way that I would sleep or relax, like in my kind of, because they're not sexy underwear either, right? They're like, you know, like Hanes full coverage underwear, right? With the cats laughing sweater. So yeah, I didn't really have a problem with this scene, but I was curious to kind of have us discuss some of the issues that this kind of scene sort of oftentimes raises. But I think that's sort of, yeah, I don't know. I agree with everything that was said. I think it's additive. I don't like the Wolverine commenting on it thing, which I find super creepy.
I wonder, okay,
Really,
so
it's creepy.
can we talk about that? It is creepy, and I'm fine with it. Okay, so Wolvie being different than Wolverine. You
Right,
alluded
right.
to
Good
this
point.
a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
We need to talk about X Babies a little bit, because this is their second real appearance at this point, and they have a weird history that goes sort of beyond this and after this. But the first X Babies were just shrunken down X-Men, so they had all the X-Men memories, but infantile personalities. The new X Babies are Mojo constructs that are built to think of themselves as the real X-Men, even though they're not. So they're impetuous like babies, but not. And I love Lil Wolvie. I think Wolvie is great here and forever, because he is the unfiltered nature of he's the parody of what makes Wolverine the cool dude like that incels love. But taken to the, of course he behaves like this, he's 4.
Yeah.
So it works for me. I don't know. It's always worked for me.
I think that actually is the thing that makes it hard. It's like really, we're getting at a really important point here, which is to me why it's always hard to read comics as a woman. Because you're filtering through decades of representations, and then you find yourself kind of trying to parse through a set of images. And it's interesting because on the one hand, this was exactly how I would have dressed then, and I'm serious, I'm just like being to me, I think maybe I'm over identifying with this character, which is really bad, I guess. But anyway, but also the way that she's drawn truly isn't not just sexualized, it's actually not very good in some respects. Like her legs are weird, and it's almost like he's going out of his way to not. But then you could argue, yeah, well, he could have added another foot of nightgown and we wouldn't be having this conversation. And they could have pushed out that comment by Wolvie and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I think that there's always going to be a legitimate concern about drawings like this. And I think totally I can see how many readers are going to say this is really problematic. To me, I kept thinking to myself, okay, given the genre, given the time period, given the subject, and also I didn't realize she was that young. I knew she was a teen, but I thought she was like probably 18, 19, something like that. I didn't have the backstory, and I'm sorry about that. But to me, it's like I can have that opinion, but totally understand how other people could look at this and say, hey, this is really a problem. And I think that's just part of reading comics,
Well, yeah, and I mean, for me too, it's like with Kitty Pryde, I'm just always like at attention for. We've talked about the various gazes sort of bound up in Kitty Pryde before. There are queer gazes bound up in her, but there is definitely a certain kind of male gaze bound up in this character as well, in terms of the girl next door who is oftentimes ultra-sexualized regardless of her age. Although she's a character that is not ultra-sexualized to the same degree because of her age, it's still always, I mean, we talked in issue number 2 about the complications of the werewolf scene where she's clawing her way out of the werewolf and sticky and wet and everything, and how it wasn't ultra sexualized. And yet, Mav, as you were saying, Alan Davis draws everybody so gorgeous that it's there regardless, right? He's almost incapable of not doing that.
I don't want to give Alan Davis a pass by saying no, I mean, just even now, I don't want to give Alan Davis a pass by saying, oh, well, he's so good an artist that he can't help but make everybody look good.
Yeah.
No,
that's a choice.
So is Art Adams. Art Adams is to this day one of my favorite artists. And again, I'm not going to pretend I'm, I encountered him as a teenage boy. So yeah, part of that is the impression he has on me as being one of my favorite cheesecake artists. But he has made clear choices here to desexualize her as a statement. And I think that's what really makes it work. Obviously, she still looks good because he's a good artist, but he has given the awkwardness. Gwen said her legs are, long. Katie has big ears. There's reasons that she has body image issues that wouldn't bother a real person, but bother us about a real person. But I see the awkwardness that she feels, and the fact that Wolvie in particular you commented on the first one where he's like a stupid skirt. The one that really works for me is later when he's doing the I see London, I see France. This is just, he's 4. He's a 4-year-old, and 4-year-olds suck. All of them do, right? If you have children, 4-year-olds are jerks. They're little jerks, but he's 4. What are you going to do? And he's a 4-year-old with the mentality of Wolverine. So of course he's making these comments. To me, that becomes a commentary on the sexualization of Kitty Pryde. But like you said, Andrew said very early on, this is participating while trying to critique, because how can it not, right? So yeah, we could have evaded the entire issue by just having her wear a nightgown instead of having her wear a sweater to sleep in. But then we can evade anything. If we're writing it, we can evade any problem, and then we don't have a story.
Well, let's get talking about the function of the X-Babies then, in terms of sort of them occupying this very weird position of kind of being the X-Men and kind of not, and sort of functioning in a position of critique because of their kind of interstitial status. Because the other moment that really creeped me out is when they're on the bus and Kitty is getting like attracted to Lil Longshot.
No,
Longshot.
That one.
Yeah.
Yes, there's both. The one for me is when she sort of gives goo goo eyes to Baby Peter,
Yeah,
and it's
there's
like,
yeah, both of those.
I
But
get it, but
yeah, but like, I mean, maybe that gets us at sort of talking about what the X babies are, right? Because they're not really children, they're not really the X-Men, there's something else. And I want to talk sort of more broadly too, if we're going to sort of academicize this a little bit, because I really want to like go serious on this super silly comic. That's like how we're going to do this episode. But you know, in terms of where they fit in kind of that archetype of like the naughty child, right? Which has a long, long history in comics, of course, going all the way back to some of the original comic strips and, you know, various other interpretations over the years, like both male characters and female characters and racialized characters. This is a very common archetype. So I was curious about where the X babies kind of fit within that history. And maybe I'll ask Gwen first and then get us to kind of sort of expand on some of the self-reflexivity of these characters in this specific place in the X-Men franchise. But did you see these characters sort of fitting in with that archetype of the naughty child, or are they kind of, is that not maybe the best way to approach these characters? What did you think, Gwen?
Well, you know, the assumptions that a culture holds about childhood can change over time. And I would say that, you know, the naughty child in transatlantic culture of the 17th and 18th century, that was a serious, serious figure at that time, because the idea was, you know, especially among Puritans in the United States, the idea was children were born with sin, they needed to repent. And so the naughty child in children's texts was meant truly and seriously to caution children and to get them to do certain things so that they would be saved. So we have to sort of think about where that figure originates, because by the time you get into the middle to latter part of the 19th century, there's an element of mischief that comes into play once that religious imperative starts to fade a bit. I would say that what these characters remind me the most of are a disruptive force. In some ways, they're not even like children. It's like the Mardi Gras or something. They've dressed up and they're just gonna like create chaos wherever they go. And so while I do see that kind of naughtiness in their 4-year-olds, there's a way in which they never feel like children to me. And I don't know if you've had that experience either, but to me, they feel more like this kind of mirror that's being held up to the comics industry, and really kind of the things that they say, especially at the end about sort of owning the terms of their work, reminds me almost more of what Hinz and Tribunella, Carrie Hinz and Eric Tribunella, wrote a book called Reading Children's Literature that's really excellent. And they talk about these models of childhood and how they've changed over time. And the model that I'm picking up really is the working child, which came into being especially when during the industrial age, when initially children were viewed as means of families making money. That shift from agrarian economy to the work economy put kids into a situation where they were often expected to be major breadwinners in the family. And many 19th century American texts, for instance, feature young people whose parents are incapable of supporting the family. And so it's the kids who are basically, you know, made to go out and get newspaper routes and do all sorts of other things to bring money in. So it's that idea kind of that this is a weird mix of, yeah, the naughty child is in here, but so is the resilient sort of worker child, the miniature adult. You know, there's some interesting sort of ways in which all these models are at play, while simultaneously these characters don't always feel like children. So it's this really weird mix so when you were asking me what I thought about this comic, I mean, I would, especially towards the end, I'm just like, good Lord, what are these characters doing here? And I mean, to me, it really felt like a lot of different sort of as models of childhood were coalescing here, but the result of this was just chaos.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, maybe how we can start to approach it is to kind of situate how some of this self-reflexivity is working within the context of the X-Men franchise and the Marvel Universe, right? We have the House of Stan and Jack. We have the Ricochet Rita character, who many of our listeners will probably already know is modeled after Ann Nocenti and was created by Ann Nocenti as somewhat of a self-insert character. So Ann Nocenti, X-Men writer, longtime X-Men editor, becomes the caretaker of the X-Babies. There's something interesting going on there for sure, right?
Ricochet Rita is literally a Mary Sue.
Yeah, she is.
She is very specifically an actual Mary Sue. And she's awesome,
She
by the
is.
way.
Yes, she is awesome. Yeah, so she gets introduced in the Longshot mini by Nocenti and also penciled by Art Adams as this kind of self-insert character. And then again, obvious symbolism of longtime editor, long-suffering editor, and Nocenti becoming the caretaker of the X babies, but also doing that in a very way that emphasizes her agency, right? Like at the end of the Longshot series, she chooses to go with Longshot and fight the good fight and against Mojo, and we see her here, you know, never being humbled by Mojo despite everything that he puts her through. And although they try to save her at the end, she chooses to jump back into the portal to protect the X babies, but also in a quest for glory, right? I mean, she has that a little bit of that selfish motive too, which I think is important in terms of making that a more complex character. But I want to come to Andrew in terms of situating this within Claremont, within X-Men. Like, what are the X babies doing for us as these figures of critique, do you think? Or are they figures of critique, or are they just like figures of chaos and fun? Like, if there's a critique here, what is it?
I think it's sort of a self-aware critique of Claremont in terms of him being aware that he's working in a medium that is perceived as juvenile. And this is sort of his way. I mean, it's almost carnival-esque, right? Of taking that juvenile
I was
aspect
thinking
to
of
an
that
extreme.
as Gwen was talking. Yeah, I was like, it's like a carnival, like it's almost like dressing up as a child to do something, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one thing I can point to is like kind of an example of the complexity of the characters. They each get picked off one by the agent, right? But the way they get picked off is character consistent. So Havok goes for fame. Psylocke goes because she's trying to act too much like an adult, which is what happened to her in Captain Britain, kind of. Rogue and Dazzler have a desperate need to be loved, which is how the agent gets them. Colossus, of course, is a martyr, and Wolverine can't resist violence. Like that's character study in these like silly little moments. So yeah, no, I think he's totally kind of trying to comment on how people perceive his X-Men and having some fun with that, whilst producing, again, a meditation on grief and an elaborate kind of commentary on sort of the mechanics of being a Marvel comic book writer at the time.
Well, Mav, you came at the beginning with sort of talking about the way that this is situated, you know, in pop culture discourse of the day. Like, how did you read this as a form of critique?
For me, a lot of what Andrew's saying, a lot of what Gwen is saying, but also just there is in Excalibur in general, in this issue in particular, Claremont has done a lot of meta awareness of the industry, right? Like he is not shy about inserting himself into the narrative, literally, which he does in this issue. You know, he physically appears, and with some sort of wink and nod, it's not clear that Kitty doesn't know that he's the guy who is writing her adventures, which is odd and, you know, proto Deadpoolish, I get, but not to the level that we've talked about She-Hulk and my love for that on this podcast before. She's not aware to the level that She-Hulk is, where she can let this affect the narrative directly, but she does seem to know who he is. And like that is an awareness of, it's a commentary on the comic book genre, particularly Claremont's place in it. The fact that Rita exists at all is a commentary on the comic book genre. If you've read the Longshot series, it's very much a Mojo exists as a, look, we are doing this about ratings. This is a comment about what it means to be an adventurer superhero. And then we paste on top of that the X-Babies, which is really, Mojo is a cynical character who just wants not even money. He just wants ratings. It's just about how many eyeballs can I get on this by keying into the pop culture of the day, to the point that, you know, he's doing the most cynical thing ever of, I'm making a baby version of my most popular characters. And I wasn't kidding. These were all over the place in 1989. Muppets Take Manhattan introduces the Muppet Babies in 1984. And then there's a cartoon version of that. Then there's Flintstones. There are baby versions of characters popping up all over the place. It was annoying and disgusting and silly. And this one works because it's not, what made the Muppet Babies work is that they were honest, right? They were honest, and they weren't cynical. They were endearing. They were proto versions of those characters in the same way that you were talking about how Colossus and Wolverine are here, right? Even the Muppet Babies theme song, you have Kermit, I like adventure, Piggy, I love romance, Fozzie, I love great jokes, Animal Dance. Like it's literally just the proto aspects of their characters distilled into a baby form. And so it can comment on that. That's what they're trying to do here. So this works for me because they're not children. They really are a simplified, you know, let us dwell on the nature of what it means to be the X-Men characters and use that lens there. So I don't think of them as babies. I don't think of them as kids. I think of them as a distilled essence.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Of course.
As you've been talking, I've been thinking a lot about this. There's the part where Kitty is talking about how, they have the kids have gone back through the portal, and she says, you should always be careful what you wish for because you may just get it right in the teeth. I'm sure Mojo's got the kids. His problem now is he's got the kids. And she says, talk about the fate you deserve. And I'm thinking about the cultural moment that this is taking place. This is just at the point where U.S. childhood is going to start to change profoundly, with kids having all these suddenly being brought indoors, brought into activities, having their lives scheduled. This is about 5 years before the Spice Girls. It's about, you start to look at the way that children in the U.S. and to a certain extent in Britain too start to have these very regimented lives in which they are constantly being supervised by adults. And there's almost a derisory attitude towards children here, which is about to be completely flipped in the culture in a way, although not entirely, but it's the idea, okay, now children need to have these, we need to protect children. Children need to have these. I grew up in the generation where it was like, yeah, go out and play, see you in a couple hours, and whatever. And
come in when it's dark.
And where like people made fun of kids in popular culture. That was a major trope of like Johnny Carson's show and these other shows. Comedians made tons of references to children in a derisory way. And then suddenly there's a shift. And it's just kind of interesting, this happening in this moment. I don't know. It just felt kind of weird to me.
Yeah, it would be interesting to kind of map the other appearances of the X Babies. They're pretty similar in like all their appearances over the years, but I am wondering now like whether some of the later appearances sort of go harder on the cuteness and the innocence than kind of the more active self-reflexivity than we get here.
They get more ridiculous as time goes on.
Yeah.
I think this is their third appearance. It's the second of the canonical.
Yeah.
It's the second appearance, I think, of the physical. We're not the original X-Men X-Babies, and it's their third overall. They've been published as recently as the last couple of years in one-offs, and I think the little Wolvie that appears in Exiles is canonically this Wolvie too. I haven't read that one. As the writers try to make them more self-aware, they lean harder and harder into the whole ridiculousness of them in a way which doesn't quite work for me as well.
Well, I almost want to get back to, there's a couple of questions that I want to get back to. Getting back to the usefulness of, even if they're not really children, like the use of like a carnivalesque child disguise at the very least to kind of mobilize some of the insights or critiques or, Mav, you called it revealing the truth of the thing, like that mouth of babes kind of idea, right? And then I'm also thinking about creator agency and, this being a commentary on that, and especially the place that Claremont was at with the franchise at this point where he's not going to be with it that much longer, and sort of the push and pull of his agency there. So those are the two questions I kept thinking about, but maybe let's start with that first one. It's sort of a basic question that I think we've talked around a lot, but like, why babies? We could have done this with a gender swapped version of the team. We could have done this with the dinosaur version of the team. We could have done this with other AU characters. There's like that cat rock star Excalibur we're going to get in a few issues. There's like various gender swapped ones, but why babies? How does it relate to those questions of sort of agency, either having to do with the characters themselves or those self-reflexive questions about agency having to do with the creators and their babies?
I think it's hyperbolically cynical, right? I think exactly as Mav has been saying, this is something that was going on in our culture at the time. And by just, doing something kind of lazy, I think it's a nice way to signal the critique.
Lazy. Yeah. I don't disagree with it. It's funny, but I'm trying to remember the storyline where it's X-Men Annual 12.
What, the original X-Babies one, or like
the original X-Babies is 10,
10,
I believe.
Yeah, but then,
and I believe 12 is the original fake X-Babies.
It's 12.
And if I remember correctly, it's been a while and I didn't reread it for this episode. So if I remember correctly, the joke is that Mojo just wants ratings and he's tried other stuff. Like he's tried funny animal versions. He's tried, and this is the one that sticks. Like I think that might be a later one too, but I think that's the Annual 12 story, and where that's the idea of it. It's
he tries gender flipped X-Men
the audition.
first.
Yeah. And then it's like, oh, well, people, the ratings are up, the Q ratings up on Babies, so Babies it is, because it really is that cynical. So like in story, I think there's a direct commentary on where culture is going, how we view childhood. Because I think Gwen's right. I think there is a change in what, not even youth is usually refers to like teenhood, to what childhood is, changes in the 90s from where it had been in the 80s, from where it had been in the 70s. So I think we're on the cusp of that. But also I think that in a book that is being programmed towards young people who the world is increasingly trying to treat them like children, where they are constantly trying to battle to being taken seriously as an adult. Like I said, I was 15 when this came out. I was a kid in my mind now, but very much an adult in my mind at the time that it came out. It's the thing where we're always talking about, where I'm always very careful about how I talk about Kitty, because I always have to think of this of, when Andrew's like, well, this is creepy. It was like, yeah, but like, would I have found it creepy at 14? Like, if I'm going to put myself in that headspace. And I think that it's very important that we're looking at a story where this is a version of X-Men that Kitty can see herself as more mature than, and needing to protect in a way that that the essence of her character has always been, even outside of Colossus is her boyfriend. I'll escape that one. Storm, Wolverine, Nightcrawler in particular, these are my protectors. These are my older siblings. They've taken care of me since I was a child, which 2 years ago for her, but now I'm returning the favor. I think that story is important, and I think that only works if they're children.
Is that really getting at sentimentality in childhood too? Because there are ways in which sentimentality can work well and convincingly, and there's ways in which it can be saccharine and make you want to hurl. And and like I had talked about the Kitty part of the text being sort of the quiet center. It's also, like I think we've talked about, an evocation of the way that young people work through grief and difficult issues, and you could view that very positively. But there's sort of a saccharine way in which children were being portrayed in the larger culture at this point. Think of Punky Brewster. Think of, what's the one with the two young men who had such terrible fates after all these children. That's the other thing. All these child actors I'm thinking of are dead or have had like terrible lives.
Yeah.
But it was like the sort of height of that kind of super sentimentalized child. And again, just for profit, and it's interesting, to think about how much of that is at work here in the way that these babies are being put forward, especially towards the end.
I'm still interested in that creator question though, right? Like, I mean, where did the X babies fit within this being a story of Claremont talking about his agency as a creator? Does that make sense as a question? Because I mean, we have the cameos from like the owner of Forbidden Planet and Claremont in this comic, and we have Kitty's recognition of Claremont on some level, which we brought up. I mean, we've talked about Kitty as a
Cats Laughing.
Yeah, and
Cats Laughing. Cats Laughing is a rock group, a real life rock group that consists of real life fiction writers that Claremont admires.
Yeah.
That's the only reason Kitty's into them.
Yeah, I know, exactly right. And I mean, I'm curious, like we've talked about Kitty as a reader surrogate, like to what extent is she being a creator surrogate in this story, right? I mean, we've got Rita being Ann Nocenti to a certain degree, but to what extent is sort of Claremont's agency sort of being filtered through Kitty in this story? Like, is that a sensible question to ask?
I think it's a sensible question. I'm not sure I see it, to be perfectly honest. Like
that's fair,
I hadn't considered it. For me, like I think this is a really good example of Kitty serving as a very strong universal protagonist. I have no problem identifying with her whatsoever, despite any age, gender, or culture gaps. I hadn't really thought of her as sort of through like her narrative agency offering commentary on sort of Claremont's station at this point in his life.
So you don't see the X babies like in any types of conversation, between, where he is in the X franchise at this point? Like, did he have any sense that his time in the franchise was coming to an end, or was he expecting to be there forever?
He was absolutely blindsided, unfortunately.
So you wouldn't read that commentary into this at all. That's just something I'm imprinting on it, knowing what happens, right?
Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, I think you can make a case. It's interesting.
But there's always that push and pull, right? I mean, that like trauma of being the work for hire creator, these characters that become his characters, that become his babies, and he's never going to be fully in control of those. And I just think about the inherent chaos of the X X-Babies as being in conversation with that on some
Yeah,
level.
no, I see the argument for, and this is maybe just me reading into it because this is not something that's been directly written about. But Claremont's relationship to his characters has always been kind of reverent. He views them as companions. He views them as pieces of himself. I don't think he sees himself in a kind of patriarchal relationship to them. But that's just my sense.
I wonder if it's just thinking about what Anna was just saying about whether or not he knows his time is over. He clearly doesn't. Just given where the storylines in not only Excalibur, but particularly where the storylines in X-Men were at the moment that he sort of loses it. He clearly had no, I mean, we don't know obviously, but like this does not read like someone who's trying to wrap things up or tried to go somewhere else. There are things that are just lost in mid-sentence when he's done. So it's bizarre. But I do think that doing a one-off, even Sword is Drawn, which is much more serious than this, but the stories in the annuals, the stories in one-offs like Mojo Mayhem, he's been doing this at this point probably 15 years.
14, 15 years.
Yeah, at this point. And I think he's trying to have fun in a lot of ways that, the self-referential thing that Excalibur allows him, I just think I'm going to have a little bit of a party here, particularly where we're going in Cross Time Caper. There's going to be a lot of, this is cute. Look, it's me and John Byrne, it's me and Anna Senti. Like, I think that there is a little bit of, I'm just enjoying myself because he's got to refresh it and make it new for himself, particularly given there's, I just talked about what this book is going to be. The book that X-Men becomes over the next year of real time for Claremont is super dark. And he's got to know that's coming. It's really, really dark. He's killing off his darlings in a lot of ways.
I was thinking about the baby X-Men as that, actually.
Yeah.
Like about 20 minutes ago, but of course I didn't give voice to it. But since you said it,
yeah, I mean, I'm just interested in like how they mobilize that, because even the role that Kitty gets put in here, where she's sort of their guardian, but sort of not their guardian, and how that's sort of like the comic book creator who's doing work for hire work, where
she's babysitting.
Yeah, she's babysitting, right? And like that's a phrase that we do bring up in terms of work for hire creators, that they're babysitting these properties, right? It's an idea that's property of the company, and they don't ever completely own that thing. And the fact that the X-Babies are always chaotic and always outside of their caretaker's control, I just see that as an interesting commentary on sort of that strange role of a creator in that space.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I totally buy that.
Fair enough. I found something intelligent to say about this book.
Oh, please.
But any kind of, we've kind of gone for a little while now, but like any sort of final thoughts, like just sort of random things that we want to bring up, sort of moments or dynamics that we didn't sort of get a chance to talk about?
I think maybe I'd like to reflect that again, because I think the important question for a lot of us is, Anna, would you call Mojo Mayhem a great Excalibur story?
I put it on my Comics XF primer as a good Excalibur story, and so like
I did change great to good there.
I put it in the bronze category. It was at the bottom of my list, but
Shameful
I mean, but it's
participation trophy.
I will say this. I think next to Sword is Drawn, it's my favorite of the Excalibur specials. Like, is that good enough?
That's fair.
Yeah, but I mean, there's not a lot of competition there, but I have appreciated it a lot more. Like in terms of something like Andrew's Claremont Red Thread, which was like all making us cry earlier. I mean, God, how can you not love this story when someone's giving you such a beautiful interpretation as that of it? So I have a new appreciation of it versus the first time I read this, where, to be honest, I was reading it for Nightcrawler, right? I'm reading the Nightcrawler scenes and kind of flipping over, and then he's not in it until the end. And then we have the callback to Uncanny 204, but nothing happens about it because it's just in thought bubbles. And I'm like, So, I mean, that's where I'm coming at it, right? So
I think that we're being weird about it. So in your primer, you listed it. Well, so here's where I'm at with it. I opened this episode with raving about it, and I do love it. I cannot be fair about this in real life. When I professionally, if I'm teaching one of my students to review a work, I always tell them, you have to write your term paper as though I am not reading this as your professor. I am reading this as a random reader who this might be their first experience with insert Tolstoy, whatever we've read, right? This cannot be your first experience with Excalibur. Mojo Mayhem, I'm going to just set aside my personal feelings. It's not a well-written story. You'd be lost. I don't understand.
What?
Like, nothing makes sense. It's just chaos. chaos. It is the best story because if you just let go of all your preconceived notions about how narrative is supposed to work and about how things are supposed to make sense, it's delightful and it's lovely and it's the essence of everything that I love about Excalibur. But I understand how you'd be turned off if you were looking for it to make sense. You know, if you were looking for consistency or logic or who the hell are these people even, everything about it is weird. But I'm not approaching Excalibur from a vacuum. I'm not approaching the X-Men from a vacuum. These are characters that, you know, in my head, there's 60 something years of history of all these people floating around. So this makes it great because I'm not going in blind. And I don't think anybody, I always say that, you know, I always like to repeat Jim Shooter's theory that every comic book is somebody's first comic book. So you've got to yell your name on every page, right? That's how he wrote comics in the 80s. This can't be your first comic. Like Mojo Mayhem, just it's not for that. It can't even really be your first Excalibur comic, though I guess it was Gwen.
Well, except that I was okay. To be fair, though, I grew up reading Mad Magazine, and there's a
Okay.
lot that's going on here
Yeah.
that's very, very like I could code back to Mad and
Yeah,
really kind of
absolutely.
see some of the same sensibility, and so I was able to make some sense of it. But you're right. I mean, if I'd only read this and Anna hadn't sent me a lot of other stuff, and if I had never read the X-Men before, okay, yeah, I would have been totally at sea. But for me, I just used my Mad Magazine self-reflexive humor, the way that they handle beloved hallowed cultural ideals, and there was a lot of that going on here, and so it wasn't that difficult. But I'm also a 57-year-old academic who's still
Right.
reading
Yeah.
comics. I'm not like a kid back in if this were the first thing I'd read in 1989, I'd be like, I wouldn't have gotten past the third or fourth page.
And you never read a comic book again. I mean, it would be,
Yeah.
but I don't think they all have to be that. Like, I think I like repeating Shooter's quote because I think it's interesting and it tells a lot about where, particularly Marvel, but DC as well, to a lesser extent, were in the mid 80s because Jim Shooter really did fundamentally believe that. But it's not true, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't do this with any other type of literature, right? Like, there are starter Shakespeare plays and then there are advanced Shakespeare plays. There's not really a starter James Joyce,
No,
but
there's
you know, like there, but you see, but there's starter literature and then there's more advanced literature, right? Like if I want somebody to become an English major, if I've got a particularly promising writer in like my freshman comp class and I'm like trying to like, yeah, you want to change majors and, you know, join the dark side and have a useless career like the rest of us, you know, I don't go, all right, you've written a good freshman essay, now let's read Ulysses, because that would be scary, right? And I don't think Mojo Mayhem needs to be the starter text. I think it's okay for it to be the quirky, weird text that's a special edition that, you know, you sit there and you go, well, what do we get out of this? You know, not everything is like, you know, laid out for you. Sometimes it's just fun to like, and we have a whole podcast devoted to just breaking these things apart and what did we get of this? And I think it makes for a more interesting conversation than Sword is Drawn, which I think is a brilliant starter text.
Yeah.
Even though Sword is Drawn, you know, we talked about on that first episode, we talked about the history that we had with the Munich Massacre or with the Nightcrawler series, or you know, we talked about backstory, but it wasn't necessary to read Sword is Drawn, and I think it is very necessary to read this. Andrew, you talked about Kitty's grief. I think you need to understand what happened to the X-Men for Mojo Mayhem to make sense, and she never tells you. It's not on the page in this book at all. There is no point where it says, okay, they died in Dallas. All you know is that she missed them, and you have to figure it out, and it certainly doesn't tell you that they're alive and being bastards by not telling
And
her.
it certainly doesn't tell you that Ileana's not technically dead, but just de-aged to her child self, so isn't the version of her that Kitty knew. I mean, that would be a lot to explain.
Right. So all of that matters in this text. And I think this makes it a more, I don't want to say better, it's a more complex text to read than Sword is Drawn. But like, since I have all that knowledge, I can enjoy it.
I'm thinking about my other thing that I was just going to point out. I think I can even relate to that just in terms of where this is situated in comics publishing. And I mean, we've talked about some of this history before, the rise of the direct to market, sort of the rise of more complex storytelling, the readers getting a little bit older that happens throughout the 1980s into the 1990s, and even the development of the special edition is related to sort of superhero comic book publishers sort of modeling their publishing models after albums and doing graphic novels, right? And Nightcrawler is wearing a flaming carrot comic t-shirt at the beginning of this comic. And so that's like a little shout out to the independent comic scene.
and not explained at all. But
Not explained.
but this comic's not on newsstands, right? When I bought this, I was working in the store already by the time this came out. So I worked in a comic book store. I was working in the comic book store already. I knew who Flaming Carrot was. I knew who Cats Laughing is. Cats Laughing is not explained once again, and I know who they are. And if you don't, I guess it's just a quirky band that Kitty likes, and that's fine. But if you do, that increases your enjoyment of the story. Andrew,
any final thoughts, things that you wanted to bring up that we didn't get to?
It's perfect, and all your critiques are invalid.
Fair enough, Andrew. Fair enough.
I don't know. I think Anna should be feeling like Kitty right now.
Do you have any final thoughts to conclude this discussion, Gwen? Anything that you want to touch on that we didn't get to?
No, just that, I think I enjoyed it more than I thought I would and more than you thought I would. And so I think that's a win.
I think that's an excellent point to end on.
I can't be a king, Archimedes. I don't know anything about ruling a country.
I told you to leave the thing in the stone, boy.
I'll run away. That's what I'll do. They'll just have to get somebody else.
Better take the side door, what? Out the side door.
So, Gwen, anything that you would like to plug for our listeners? Where can people find you if you want them to find you, and what's some of their work that they can of yours that they can check out? Because we will link it in our show notes as well, but give it a shout out on mic as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm on Twitter at Gwen Tarbox, and I would encourage people who are interested in children's comics to pick up my book from Bloomsbury. Children, it's very creatively titled. It is exactly what it is: children's and young adult comics. But I went with Bloomsbury in part because they really subsidize their academic texts, so they're super affordable. I think the Kindle edition of my book is $14, and It's the kind of book where it's useful if you're teaching comics, but also if you're sharing comics with kids. It gives you kind of an insight and a way to talk to kids about comics as well, although that's not the primary audience. But the primary audience are undergrads. You can get that anywhere wonderful books are sold. So.
And it is an excellent book. I have read it, and I would second that recommendation, that it's a great sort of primer for the topic, but that also gets into complexities that will be of interest to experienced comic scholars as well. So I think you're hitting a lot of bases with that book, and I think anybody that enjoyed our conversation about children's comics would definitely find it a great book to check out. So thank you so much for joining us, Gwen. I'm just thrilled to have your insights on this episode.
I had so much fun. I want to hang out with you guys more. I mean, seriously. This was a blast. So
we'd be happy to have you every week. It was great talking to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, in 1 week's time, we'll be back on the crazy train with Excalibur number 15, TechNet Impossible Missions, which, as the title suggests, spotlights the TechNet in a surprisingly serious story. Also, Kurt becomes a saloon hostess and Kitty becomes a vampire. We've got another super smart guest lined up to help us navigate those developments. In the meantime, if you liked what you heard, please follow us, like, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to it or watching it. Don't forget to check out our fabulous YouTube videos, which you can find via our website. As always, if you want to chat with us about Excalibur or pitch yourself as a guest for a future episode, let us know. You can reach out via our website, goshgollywow.com, where we've got some fun extras, and via Twitter at goshgollywow, where we post daily pages from whatever issue we're reading that week, and more fun extras. Thank you, Andrew and Mav, for another very self-aware conversation. Thank you, Gwen, for lending us your expertise. Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks to Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our truly epic theme song. Play us out.
Crazy.